Good afternoon and welcome to the International Press Center here in Copenhagen. We are very glad to have you with us for this briefing this afternoon, both for the audience here in the room and for the journalists joining us on Zoom online. My name is Peter Krause. I work here at the Press Center, and we've been looking very much forward to having the briefing this afternoon with our speaker, Vad Mathiesen, professor from Aalborg University. I think it's safe to say that Brian is one of the top experts in Denmark on everything related to energy and also the green future setup of our energy systems. And with the war in Ukraine now in its year 2 and an endless range of initiatives across Europe to pave the way for future energy systems, I know there's going to be a lot to discuss today. So we've agreed with Brian that he'll do a presentation first, and then after that we'll go to a Q&A. And for some of the media joining us on Zoom, we'll do this via the chat in Zoom, but we'll get back to that after Brian's presentation. So without much further ado from my side, Brian, a warm welcome, and we're happy to see you. The floor is yours.
Thank you for the invitation to come here today. So this is a very serious situation, I believe, and I hope that you'll have some good questions because things are really moving fast still. There's some kind of notion that the energy crisis is over. I don't believe that is true at all, but it seems that both the public and some of the press seems to react rather fast with other news in the world, but also due to falling prices, there might be a lack of understanding that we're still in a rather bad situation. So Europe has really done quite a lot over the years. If you recall, we had the Juncker Commission posting the Energy Union some years back, and it actually imposed or built on some of the successes in Europe on renewables and on energy efficiency. But it also entailed a notion that we should diversify the natural gas markets. And it also had huge investments in both electricity infrastructure and natural gas infrastructure in the so-called PCI list of projects of common interest. Billions have been put into infrastructure over the last years, and it only stopped actually short before the energy crisis started. So we have also seen quite a lot of failure because as we had more renewables and more energy efficiency, we could see that our dependency on natural gas actually rose. And this is because this diversification strategy failed. How can you diversify if you're still completely dependent on one supplier? Then a market diversification is not really helping a lot. During the years, we wanted to phase out coal as well. This increased our use of natural gas. And at the same time, our own resources in Europe fell. Many of you know some of the elements. You can mention, for example, the Netherlands, where some of the really large European natural gas fields have been shut down. The UK, who's not in EU anymore, but still part of Europe, also have much lower oil and natural gas resources. And when we increase our use or keep it stable, then our dependency on import, of course, increases as our EU domestic consumption or production, falls. The situation is rather grave, and I think I just want to show you this illustration. Everybody, of course, probably have seen these kind of maps before. But here you see the inflow of natural gas, where 40% came to Europe through those that came from Russia, those lines from Russia. What happened last year was that there was a halt to Nord Stream 2, which was actually completed, and then we had, of course, this bombing or explosion, unknown of some sort, of Nord Stream 1 and 2. But I just want to remind you that the history is that we have all of these lines here. One of them is actually still in operation, going through the Ukraine. If Nord Stream 2 had been commissioned and was put into action, all of these other lines would have been obsolete. And it doesn't require much capacity to understand that that would have changed completely the geopolitical situation in Europe, where Russia and Germany would be the only ones that would actually be in control of this amount of gas inflow in Europe. And of course, for Russia, it would have meant that they would only have to negotiate with Germany and would not have to have this complication with all of these EU countries and Eastern European countries who are much more skeptical towards Russia. So the point is, this could have taken all of this natural gas through there. And I think we're pretty lucky that that didn't happen, because even if we didn't have this war now, it is clear that if we had that situation, then when some kind of conflict would start, the dynamics would be completely different. Now, Denmark is not very depending on natural gas. If you're interested in that, I can tell you a bit more about that. We only have gas dependency of 16%, and we decreased quite significantly our consumption. 1/3 is in the heating sector, 1/3 in the heat and power, or in the power sector, and 1/3 is in the industrial sector. Europe is not only depending on oil and gas, or on gas, it's also depending on oil. And the red lines here illustrate the oil lines to Europe. And I bring this along because I think these boycotts, or let's say these policies that we're doing on both oil and gas, do have different complications for different parts of Europe. Now, if you look at these oil lines going down to Eastern Europe, there will be refineries there supplying Eastern Europe with diesel and petrol. And those logistical systems have to be completely changed due to the stop of getting Russian oil. So you have to imagine that they would have to get refined oil from elsewhere in Europe, which complicates these things. So if you look at it from an energy perspective, some of the European countries are extremely depending on natural gas for heating, primarily from Russia. But some of these countries are also extremely depending on oil, because their refineries and the logistics around those refineries are completely built up on these lines from Russia. The energy dependency is really bad in Europe. Actually, this one over here, you probably can't see anything else but the colors. This is the year 2000, and this is the coal consumption in each country. The green represents imports of coal in the different countries, and there are a few places that stick out. For example, Germany, but also actually France and Italy. They have large imports of coal, and half of that is from Russia. So it's not only oil or natural gas, it's also coal. This graph here illustrates the energy dependency of the different countries, and here you see the EU average. The yellow is 2000 and the blue is 2020. And for EU, our dependency on imports has increased since the year 2000. I touched upon that when I started the talk here. But you also see there are really some countries that have a very, very large dependency. For example, this is Malta. Makes complete sense that that has a very high dependency. Denmark is here, and we're actually the ones that were exporting quite a lot in the year 2000. Right now, we're not exporting anything, but there will be some oil fields in the North Sea starting up again. Did anybody hear about the Tyra field? Yeah. So when the Tyra field starts again, this will slightly change, so we will decrease it slightly. We will still be net importer. Tyra field is not that big, but we are able then to supply the 16% that I talked about before. If we imagine that we do what we have proposed, so at Aalborg University and the Engineering Association, we propose to decrease the natural gas consumption in Denmark by up to 80%, and I think around 33% for Europe, with concrete measures to try and do that. If we do that, then we would be able to supply the Danish domestic gas supply with biogas, the existing biogas production. If we then imagine that the Tyra field opens again, and then we would be able to completely send that abroad. And there's some notions about what the numbers are. How much would that help? There's also talks about another field, I think it's called the Sana field, that could be opened in the Danish part of the North Sea. But if we export all of the gas from the Tyra field, we contribute by around 0.3% of the European import. And you did hear correctly. So this is just to say the quantities here are so extremely large. And I think this also illustrates how serious this situation is, and that we're not over. This is not over at all yet. Denmark cannot contribute with almost anything for Europe. Of course, we should do what we can, but we're such a small part. And the consumption is so big due to these lines that we had for Russia, where we increased our dependency. We also have some interesting policies that went on. And on this illustration here, you see the countries from which we got imports, or we imported natural gas and oil and coal from. And of course, we can replace some of this with other imports. I guess you know some of the policies that we're doing. One of them is LNG. The other one is to make fuel switch. But if we do either of those, we do have to have good relations with quite a few countries that we might have a hard time also dealing with due to other policy elements. I don't have to mention Mr. Habeck's travel to Qatar to make a deal in the midst of a big debate about the World Cup and all of the other things that are going on. But there are some interesting countries here: Qatar, Algeria, Colombia, Saudi Arabia, Nigeria, Iraq, Libya, that makes this, of course, not an easy thing to solve if we want to just replace it with other fossil fuels. There are some very, very good news about what is going on right now that can sort of make us maybe believe that we can relax. But we have to tell the good stories as well. And this is really a good story, because if we look at the European situation, we have decreased our consumption of natural gas by 20 to 25%. This is really a big success, because underlying this, there's a situation that we use more natural gas than previously in our power sector. So even though we've used more in our power sector, we have saved so much that the total consumption has gone down. At the same time of this lower consumption, we have increased the LNG part, the liquefied natural gas. That's the blue part on top here. And of course, we have decreased our import from Russia. And since last year in July, I've been proposing to completely eliminate our import of natural gas from Russia, because I think Europe is ready to do that. We could already see in the beginning of August last year that the filling rate of natural gas in our storages was faster than what we could expect, even though the natural gas inflow from Russia had already decreased much more than what was expected at that time. So in August last year, we could see the signs of this situation, that we are doing a lot to do savings or save natural gas. Of course, this is a combination of several issues. So it's a combination of a fuel switch, actual savings due to price structures, but also electrification of some of the consumption of natural gas. It has really been a big success, and this is from last week. This graph here shows the natural gas storages in Europe, and you see that we are really on at the top, let's say, trend that we have had for the last 5 years on the filling rate of natural gas, and this is really a huge success. And actually, we are now in a situation where we are filling up the storages already. Just, I think it was on Friday the 18th, we saw that Europe started to increase gas to our storages in Europe. And this is really a big success that is due to the measures in Repower EU, but also, of course, due to the very high prices that we have been exposed to as citizens and in the industry. Now, the electricity market has been really, really hard hit. I don't know, can I move over here? Is it okay? Yeah. What we saw in 2022 would have, some of the things in the electricity market would have taken place even without the energy crisis. Now, the energy crisis started in the summer of 2021. I don't know, probably most people don't really follow the electricity bill at that time, but I did. And other people also did that are interested in this. And at that time, we could see increasing prices on electricity. That had the reason that natural gas prices was increasing because the inflow of natural gas to Europe had started to decline. So at that time, I would claim that Putin was preparing to have a conflict to be able to put pressure on Europe due to our security of supply. That happened, but other things happened as well. French nuclear failed completely, or at least half of it failed, which meant a lot for Europe. And the other thing that happened was that climate change made the perspiration in Southern Europe fail, so the hydropower did not contribute as much as it usually does. And what you see here is what happened in Europe in 2022. So compared to 2021, we lost around 120 terawatt hours of electricity. This is almost 4 times the annual electricity demand in Denmark. So this is quite significant that is taken out of the mix. This has nothing to do with the war. It might have something to do with COVID, because the maintenance of French nuclear was postponed to some extent during that period. But it is also due to a lack of attention to maintenance in general. And it's also a sign that the nuclear fleet in Europe is old. And we don't really know what happens with old nuclear power plants, because we haven't had any that are that old in that quantity. Now they started to reopen again, but now they actually also found new security elements that they have to investigate. Anyway, that happened. On top of that, around 2 times the Danish electricity demand failed from hydro. So it's really a very large quantity that fell out, that has nothing really to do with the war. Luckily, there was a heavy surge of renewables. So 1 year to the next, 71 terawatt hours of wind and solar was installed or was produced in 2022, which is really great, because if that hadn't been the case, we would have been even worse off than we were in that year on the prices. This is the additions of coal and gas, and the predominant part here is actually gas. And then there was a demand decrease because of the high prices, quite significant decrease that was also made, which is part of the success that we had. There's also projections about what will happen in 2023. This is by the consultancy called Ember, and they believe that the additions of renewables will increase, that coal and gas will decrease quite significantly, and that we will have some bounce back of the consumption of electricity in Europe. So there's a lot of debate about what we should do about this, and I'll just try and touch upon a few of those things. Now, in the electricity sector, we talk about levelized cost of electricity. So this means we have to find out what does 1 kilowatt hour of electricity cost, when you count in what the lifetime of a given plant is, what the operation and maintenance costs are, and what the upfront investment costs are. And when you do that and compare the statistics, and this is actually one that has a few years on its back, but it's still valid, you can see that offshore wind power fell in cost around 10% from 2000 to 2019. Onshore wind fell by more than 20% in the same period. PV fell by, I think 90%, 80% or something like that in that period. Coal had the same price, and nuclear increased in price during that time. And the reason for this increase is multitude. One of the reasons is actually Fukushima, that we are putting more demands on how to do it. The other reason is that we hadn't built a lot of nuclear power plants for many years, and that of course increases the costs of that. We can also look forward into what happens in the future with these costs, and there are no expectations that nuclear will go down in price. It'll probably stay the same or be higher. But there are huge expectations that offshore wind will go down in price. By 2030, that's expected to decrease by another 30%. Onshore wind is expected to decrease around 20% more, and the same for photovoltaics. So if you want to do something about the electricity prices, we need to install those things that we know are cheap. Is everybody aware of how the electricity market works? No. I'll just explain a few things about it. It's of course a rather complicated deal, because we have to build a plant that produces the electricity, and we have to transport the electricity, and then we have to make this thing balance, because the light that we have here is produced when we use it. And that is of course a thing that makes things slightly complicated. The majority of electricity is traded in a day-ahead market. Then there's a lot of other financial markets, more short-term markets, but this is what's called the merit order of electricity markets. And what we see here is the different types of production we have, and that's a given capacity that we have installed. And then we have a price to operate these. And this is the marginal price, so it's not the investment cost. So when we have a wind turbine, for example, or a nuclear power plant, that's the major part of the cost. That is done when we build it. Then when we have to trade it into the market, it will be offered to the market with a very low cost. And if we have a very low demand, we pay next to nothing for the electricity. I think a lot of people know this by now, that if you wash your clothes at night or charge your electric vehicle at night, it's very cheap. But that's not always the case, because we have higher demands and we can't move around everything. And then what comes in after wind and solar is nuclear, then we have lignite, coal, then we have combined cycle natural gas and open cycle natural gas. And depending on the megawatt hour or the capacity that's needed on the market, then the price will be set. And if we want to decrease the prices, then wind and solar can really help that quite a lot. We want to increase the prices on those things that pollute. This is where the ETS market comes in. So that will put on cost on coal and natural gas. So that's how it works. We can also look at the statistics of how it has worked. And here, this is the Danish statistics. So if we have around 50% wind power in the electricity mix in Denmark, the prices are around 40% lower in a historic setting. Of course, this may change in the future. Probably you heard about this electricity market reform. And this is, in my opinion, extremely concerning because, as opposed to what many people think, this merit order way of ensuring investments and dealing with the market has been rather well functioning. There's not anything to suggest prior to the conflict that this was not functioning more or less okay, I would say. And nobody at least complained about it before the crisis. Now a lot of people have a lot of opinions about how this works. And of course you can say if the natural gas power plant sets the price, then the wind power also gets that really high price. And you can discuss whether that's fair or not. The question is then, what do we do about it? And one of the things that has been done is that we've enforced this windfall tax. And the windfall tax is about having an extremely high profit without having done anything about it. That is, in theory, a really good idea. In practice, an extremely hard thing to manage and to do and to implement. Because who is to be taxed at what time and how do we enforce it? That's and the different European countries have done this with different models. Some have taxed the companies themselves. Some have tried to enforce something on the market itself. Other proposal has been to divide the market into some market for things that are non-flexible and things that are flexible. So the non-flexible would be renewables, for example, could also be nuclear in that sense, and then the flexible issues. The problem is that you will then have two different price signals that would mean that let's say the European states and the EU would be able to accept a, let's say, much higher price for part of the market compared to the other part of the market. You would also not be able to, let's say, be sure that the financing mechanism is going to those electricity elements that are the cheapest. Typically what you see is that those that have proposed to have this kind of model is talking about a CFD market. That's a contract for difference. So it means that we make a bid, and then those who win that bid will then get a fixed price. And there's a lot of countries who are very interested in nuclear power in Europe, and they would then, if that was allowed to have as part of the market, that would mean that the states in those countries would be able to support nuclear power even though the marginal or the real cost would on the market be higher. So that kind of you can have that debate, but it would distort the market in a way where you wouldn't necessarily get the cheapest options. The market reform is a debate that's going on. There were some things that came out. This is Bruegel who did some review about this that came out actually today, and they are rather concerned about how this is going to work, because there are some openings to do state subsidies and EU subsidies of different elements, either in these CFD models or also power purchase agreement models. There's also talks about to have the financial forward markets have a larger role than they do today. They talk about different elements here, the sort of more state-driven or the market-driven, and then they talk about a European focus or a national focus. And how this ends is really hard to see, but I would expect that once you get down to actually doing changes in these markets, that you will see that what we have is actually rather good, and that those changes that we will have will be minor, and if we do changes, they will run over a rather long time. The main problem, in my opinion, with the current market is that there's a lack of support for capacity that we're not using. And I've been working with the European Commission for around 10 years in different projects, and also having talks to the civil servants or in different settings. And there is a clear tendency that the European TSOs, the transmission system operators, are very focused on integrating renewables by trading electricity between countries. So this is all the talk about interconnections, that we connect and then we can share the renewables. This is a notion that, in my opinion, is fine if our ambition level is to have 10, 15, 20% renewables in our mix, then it works fine. But once we start to get more than that, you have two problems. One problem is that the production you have from PV and wind power will be at the same time as those on the opposite side of your interconnection, meaning that you won't get any money for it, or technically you won't be able to sell it because they have their own PV or wind power. That's one problem. The other problem is then when we don't have wind or PV, then we started to depend on getting electricity from that line, which has a major problem because with the, let's say, weather phenomenons are that we have a high pressure or low pressure for 1 or 2 weeks. And then most likely, if in Germany they don't have any wind power, we don't have any wind power here. And we can't buy from the same power plants on the opposite side of the line as, for example, in Germany. So it means that we might have a lack of capacity, because when the TSOs are focusing on these interconnections, they are also forgetting, in my opinion, to support the power plant capacities that need to be there when we don't have wind power and PV power. There seems to be a lack of understanding of that, because the focus is really these interconnections. And then some of the arguments would be, well, there's a time difference as to when we have the renewables. That's right, but the time difference does not solve a situation where it's very cold, for example, and we don't have any wind power and we don't have any sun. And this is the notion of how a renewable energy system works is not very good in some of these policymakers' minds, and also in the transmission system operators' settings. In a renewable energy system, you need to have power plants, but they should not operate very, very much. And then a lot of people may say, well, isn't that an economic problem? And actually it's not, because the power plants are rather cheap when they're not operating, but of course expensive when they're operating. But the whole idea is to have them operate maybe 10 to 20% of the time instead of today 60 to 70% of the time. But I doubt that that will be a major part of this reform, but that's what I hope that will be part of it. I should stop soon, right, Peter? Or how much time do I have left? How much time should I use more?
I think we've said we'll be until 4:30, so there's a bit of time, but also I know the colleagues here are keen to get some questions in.
Yeah, so I will just use 4 or 5 minutes more. So we work a lot with smart energy systems, and this is a concept that entails that we work with all parts of the grids, so to say. And one of the things that, I'll just skip that one. One of the things that we're working on is actually sort of how to integrate storage. And there's a big misunderstanding about what the use of storage is, also in the EU Commission's work. And storage is not about having storage until we don't have wind power or PV. Storage is to be able to increase the amount of wind power and PV, to then store it in the uses. And here we see, for example, electricity storage at a cost of 125 euros per kilowatt hour. And here we see a thermal pit storage. This is a really large pit with hot water in it. That is 1 euro per kilowatt hour. So there's a factor of 100 difference in the storing energy like this. We also have a big difference in smaller storages like the Tesla Powerwall, and larger storages. This is a pumped hydro. So you pump up water and get the power out when you generate on the way down. This is a 200-liter tank in a household, and this is a more than 200,000 cubic meter tank. So bigger is better, thermal is much cheaper. And we work quite a lot with that, and we can see that thermal storage is 100 times more cheaper than electricity storage. Gas storage is maybe 50 times cheaper than thermal storage. Liquid fuel storage is 2 to 5 times cheaper than that. What does that mean? Well, it means that when we redesign the system, we have to store in those media that are the cheapest. And you would then say, well, we can't charge our phone with thermal energy. No, but we still need to heat our houses in the future, and we also need to have a shower in the future. So the idea is we put in other kinds of storages so that we can build it up. We have done that here in a plan for Denmark. It's called IDA's Climate Response. I can tell those that are interested in that more. We try to document how we can meet the 70% greenhouse gas reduction target in 2030 with known technologies. No CCS, very little power to X, but really known technologies. And we also work with something called Heat Plan Denmark, where we have a map of all of Denmark to try and see those 400,000 natural gas customers, how many of those could get district heating. And out of the 400,000, we believe 260,000 could get district heating, and 100,000 could get individual heat pumps. And that means that we expand the district heating to up to 70% in Denmark. Now, I'll just skip this, and then I'll go to this one. So, sometimes when you take this Danish case, people will say, well, that goes in Denmark, but not elsewhere. And then normally I say, well, the laws of physics are kind of the same when you go somewhere else, so it can't be a problem. And I think the Netherlands illustrates this really well, where you can see that they have surplus heat that could supply almost twice the amount of heat that they have a demand for in the houses. So of course due to a very large petrochemical industry, but they have next to no district heating. And this is in a country that's the same size as Denmark, but has 3 times the amount of inhabitants. So there's really a lot of things that can be done in Europe. And the Netherlands is almost 100% depending on natural gas. And now they don't really have a lot of gas themselves because they're closing down their domestic natural gas production. So we looked at that for entire Europe in a project called Synergies. This is a clean planet for all. Has anybody heard about a clean planet for all? No. Europe has these strategies scenarios to have to meet the climate targets, the Paris Agreement climate target, and they made these visions for that in a project called, or in a report called, A Clean Planet for All, and we've been working with that, and what we can. I'm sorry, I think I have to skip this one. I'll just go forward to. Yeah. When we look at that, we try to compare our own work with their work. In that model, A Clean Planet for All, they have a scenario called 1.5 check. 1.5 refers to the degrees that we accept under the Paris Agreement. And this then represents the investments that is needed in that scenario. Using this smart energy system approach, we can see that we can decrease the costs with more than 20%. Down here you see the same graphs, but for the primary energy consumption. This is the 1.5 tech. Here you see renewables, here you see biomass, here you see nuclear, here you see oil. In our 1.5 scenario here, you can see that we decreased the primary energy consumption by 20%, and we can supply that system with wind and PV, renewables, and bioenergy. So we try to illustrate how this is possible. And one of the things that we're doing is we're expanding district heating in Europe to supply almost 50% of the heat. With excess heat from industry, we are able to supply actually 100%. But due to the geographics, we can't do that because the industry might be placed far away from houses. So we use a geographical information system, or GIS, to actually map that. And we have, for Europe, 100 by 100 meter. We're able to go in and see, okay, here it makes sense with district heating, here it does not make sense. So we propose different elements like that. And we then also put that into relation to this Repower EU work. And actually our results are very similar to Repower EU, even though we didn't know what was coming out. The only thing that they are missing is they have a bit too high ambition on buildings refurbishment, because we won't be able to do that much by 2030. A bit too little on redesigning the heat system that I just talked about. But the major problem actually in Repower EU is the hydrogen strategy. It does not make sense to increase the level of hydrogen in a situation where we need energy. We don't need to impose that many losses in our system to do that much hydrogen. And we can't see where we should use all of that hydrogen in 2030. So we believe that's the worst part of Repower EU. But as I said earlier, most of the things are actually really good and working quite well. I think that was what I wanted to say, Peter. And now I guess open for questions.
Thank you, Brian. That was wonderful. Thanks a lot. And I think what we'll do is that we'll open up for questions here from the room first. So I'll hand this microphone around. Just raise your hand and I'll make a note. And then if you could be kind just to say your name, and if you're a freelancer working for media, then Brian will also know. And then we just take it from there. I think I saw a hand from Staffan first.
Thank you. Actually, my name is Staffan Dahlev. I'm a Swedish freelancer. I work for Swedish, Danish, and also European media. I've got several questions. I'll try to make it short. Start with the last thing you said about the hydropower. Your explanation to how we come there, is that because of the interests of the natural gas actors in order to find a new way of using the gas? Okay, you need not say more. Second thing, question was, you mentioned this balance between power production and wind, and we often hear that there is always wind somewhere. But if I understood you correctly, that's wrong.
Yeah. I will answer a bit longer, but...
Final thing then, the proposal from the Commission about this new reform, I try to understand it, I have failed so far, and I understand you say don't do it. Is that correct interpretation?
Well, it's not as... Well, I'll start with the hydrogen question. So the hydrogen target has been made by those who sell gas today. And I think in a lot of places in policies and in branch organization, there's an idea that if we use gas today, we should also use gas tomorrow, which is completely wrong. I mean, there's so much natural gas being used to boil water in the food industry, for example. It does not make sense. That has to go out and we have to put electricity again. One of the reasons, of course, is that there are some interests to keep a focus on gas, and that's also why you see crazy things like using hydrogen for heating, for household heating. Now you imagine we have to put up a wind turbine, convert that, lose 50% to make 40-degree hot water. It makes no sense at all. But this is what you see. You even see it in this report I showed you, A Clean Planet for All. It comes along everywhere. Regarding the market reform, then it is really hard to see what it actually is that they want to do. I have also been in touch with some of, let's say, had some internal talks with some of these that are behind, and my impression is that it's not as bad as you could have feared, because one of the elements that are still open is to open for national level policies on specific technologies. That is a bit counterintuitive if we also want to trade. An example is that last year we saw Spain and the Iberian Peninsula wanting to have a special setting. EU Commission allowed it. What happened was that the Spanish government, let's say, paid the difference between a normal electricity price and what the natural gas price setting was. That price setting difference was paid by the Spanish state, which meant that the French had really cheap electricity from the Iberian Peninsula, but also that the Spanish kept on using too much electricity. And I think that there's really a lot that talks against doing these kind of national level policies, because then you'll get maybe 27 different kind of settings, and it's not going to create the cheapest options for the citizens.
Thank you. Any more questions? Yeah, Yoko, there you go.
Hi, I'm Yoko Inoue. I'm a freelance from Japan. I'd like to know a big picture. As far as I understand, Denmark stands out when it comes to renewable energy among the whole energy consumption, and I see many numbers. So if you can tell me the current state, how much is the percentage of renewable energy among the energy consumption, and whether it's like largest in the world, I would like to know. That's number one. And also, I think as a big goal, you have you try to aim carbon neutral in 2050. I thought, and it's actually Japan has the same goal the difference is whether whether you're going to depend on nuclear power or not. So I'd like to know maybe likelihood and maybe the big hope that what kind of technology will bring that kind of goal achievable.
Very good question. So we don't build anything on hope in our research, at least. But I would say as to what stands out in the Danish case is really the intermittent part of the intermittent share of the electricity supply. So how much wind and PV do we have? There are other countries in Europe that have similar or higher amounts of renewables when you look at the whole picture, because either they have nuclear or they have hydro, and that can mean that they have a higher share of renewables than we do. But if you look at the electricity system, we have more than 50% wind power and PV, and this is really unique. And I think there's nowhere in the world that you have that much. And to be able to handle that, of course, is a model that a lot of countries are interested in. How do we have an electricity grid like that? And I'll try not to become too technical, but the way we handle it is, of course, with a lot of interconnections to surrounding countries. And people believe that is why we can handle it. But when you look at the statistics, we can see that we are actually more or less a transit country. So, you know, we have the Norwegian hydro, and then we have the German market. 80% of the time, we're simply transit. So most of the time, we're actually handling these things ourselves. One of the major challenges is to keep these power plants there that we're not using. And if we don't do that, then we're in big trouble. But this is really one of the things where Denmark is a good model for elsewhere. And where we have a very high share, I think it's 55% or something like that, of the electricity supply. For the climate neutral goal, the current government has changed the date. And I'm very happy to see that, because last year we made a report to do that. So we proposed to push it forward, the climate neutral goal, to 2045. So now that is also the government target, and that report that I showed you on one of the slides actually documents how that can be done with renewables. And what we need in such a system is, of course, to design it so we're able to handle it. And we can do that. Most of the things that we need in a 2045 climate neutral system are technologies we already know. 80 to 90% are technologies we already know very well. Those things that we don't know, we also need if we have partly renewables. So if you take the electricity supply, you have wind power and PV, and then some kind of fuel for those hours where we don't have wind power and PV. If you change some of that with nuclear, you would still need something that can step in when you have a peak demand, some kind of power plant that can take the peaks. So you still need some kind of balancing. So if we take that part out, then all of the things we need to change in the system are similar, whether you have nuclear or only renewables. Things like electrification of industry, electrification of transport, power to X to fuel the planes, district heating to use waste heat from everywhere, electric heating through individual heat pumps, the change of the agricultural sector. If we want to be climate neutral, we also have to have a sink, because we can't decrease all of the emissions from agriculture, for example. And that's where we talk about CCS, carbon capture and storage. But you need that whether you have a nuclear-based system or a renewable-based system. So I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about what the challenges actually are, because they're very similar, the challenges. Most of the things are known technologies. And for sure, the challenges are very similar if, for example, Japan continues to have a mixed strategy with nuclear and renewable, the challenges in the Japanese system will not be much different from what we have if we have a 100% renewable system. Does it make sense?
Thank you. And Rolene, yeah, please. I'll just hand the microphone over to you.
Hi, my name is Rolien and I'm a journalist from Holland. I have two questions. One is about district heating. If I understand you correctly, then you advise to maximize district heating in Europe. What would be the sort of the result of that? What would it mean if more countries would have more district heating?
So it means a lot of things, I would say, but mainly it would mean that you are much less vulnerable. If we take the Netherlands as the case, then in the Netherlands there's a huge effort to change the heating system, and there has been that actually for some years now. One of the problems in the Netherlands is that you have a rather weak electricity grid, because you've been used to having a lot of natural gas, both for heating and for cooking. So that means that the distribution grid is actually, on average, a bit weaker than the European average. And I think what most people don't realize is that the heating of a house or a business is very different and much larger, the energy demand, than for electricity. Like let's say a household uses 5,000 kilowatt hours per year of electricity. Then if you compare that to heating, then normally that would be 3 times the amount. So that would be 15,000 kilowatt hours. And now back to what are you doing in the Netherlands and what should we do in Europe? So if we imagine we take those 15,000 kilowatt hours and put them on top of the electricity demand, that has a huge implication. The reason is that these 5,000 that we use right now of electricity, that is sort of dispersed over the day and night, but it's rather constant over the year, maybe a little higher in the winter. When we put the heat demand on top, you have to imagine we put 15,000 kilowatt hours on top of the 5,000. The distribution of that will be that it'll be very low in the summer, but very high in the winter, which means that you may need to expand the electricity grid 4 to 5 times in some areas of Europe. That is extremely expensive to do, so that's one of the challenges we have. The other challenge is that there's no correlation between wind power and the heat demand. So that means that when it's really cold, for example, we have seen that. You're from Sweden, you know it very well. When it's cold, for example, here in the Nordic region, there's so much electric heating, especially in Norway, but also in Sweden, that the electricity prices increase. And there has to be a power plant in the other end. Now, we're used to handling Norway and Sweden because that system has been built up for years. But if we imagine Europe starting to have a strategy where we electrify everything, this challenge I talked about before about power plants, just to have the hours covered where we don't have wind and PV, that is amplified by at least a factor 2 or 3. So that's just partly sort of the technical. Then we have the economic issue, that it's much cheaper to produce hot water than to produce electricity. And if you have an area where you have a neighbor, it makes a lot of sense to share those investments. And that's what you do with a thermal grid. And then it creates a possibility to kind of capture that waste heat that we have all the way around, and it makes the system more robust. So these things that we have also seen last year and some years back, where there has been some fallouts of Belgium nuclear, for example, in a situation where it was very cold. Then when you have a one energy carrier system, you're extremely vulnerable. So imagine here in Copenhagen, the power fell out, you'd still be able to heat your house. It wouldn't be a problem. But if you had 2 days of power fallout, in a country where you have a lot of electric power, you're not very robust. The third thing I'd like to say is that when we compare the European countries, then, I mean, with all respect for the Danes, they complain a lot, but we didn't have a lot of problems, if we're honest, compared to other places. Our buying power is much higher than other places, and we only had 400,000 households on natural gas compared to almost 2.5 million on district heating. If we had not had district heating, the situation would have been gravely worse here. If we had had district heating in Europe, the situation would have been much better for everybody. And this is, I think this is really the situation, that it can create some kind of robustness if we have that. Now, you shouldn't misunderstand me, we shouldn't have district heating everywhere, of course not. But a lot of cities, it really makes sense, and the Netherlands, clearly.
But if I just can, I just want to
Yeah,
understand, so we have models also that say, well, if we maximize district heating, we can, in Europe, we can be, an X amount less dependent? Or
Yes. We have done some calculations on what these things mean. Okay. If we change that, and if we change the heating system, how much natural gas can we save? And we're going to do more about that this year, actually, that we hope will come out with some new reports in the fall. But we do have something if you're interested already now.
One short last question. What do you think in Denmark, what do you see as like promising projects when it comes to renewables? Where does Denmark stand out? Or
that's a big question, but I'll answer.
Like concrete projects, you know?
Yeah, so it's more what you mean by renewables, but I think that we have been a forerunner for many years. Right now, we're not really a forerunner on several issues. I mean, there's just a few issues. So if we talk about these energy hubs, energy islands, right? I think we were some of the first that mentioned it, but I think now, I don't know how far you are in the Netherlands, but I know that there are concrete projects that are actually further along than what we have. On the other hand, it's not very simple. People regard this as something simple, and it's not. And if you follow the Danish debate about this open door, that is not the same as the energy hubs. It's not the same as offshore. It's extremely complicated to do, to have a debate about this. The amount of plants that we had in Denmark when that was closed down, the amount of electricity that would have been put in, mind-blowing. And so you can't complain that we're not doing all of that. On the other hand, we have to do something. If I should mention one project that I think sticks out, I would mention the Høst project in Esbjerg. It's an ammonia electrolysis plant.
Can you say it again? Sorry,
Høst, H-Ø-S-T. It's Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners that are doing it. Another thing that stands out actually is on the next to Høst, they're doing a large-scale heat pumps in a city that has, well, a district heating system that has 100,000 inhabitants. And I think that most systems also in Denmark have had these big power plants. And now they're actually building a system completely without any power plants, but with heat pumps. And I think that can be a model. And I know, for example, Hamburg and a lot of other European cities are looking at that. But for electrolysis, the Høst project.
Thanks, Rolin, also for the questions. We'll just call out for the journalists on Zoom. If anybody wants to get in with a question, you can just write in the chat. But otherwise, we'll go to Johannes. Just introduce yourself.
My name is Johannes from Reuters. According to the new IPCC report, emissions must be halved by the mid-2030s. Do you see this goal as attainable?
No, I see that as extremely hard. A global ambition on that level is going to be very, very hard. And for sure, if we want to achieve something like that, we need to focus on known technology and the cheapest possible transition. And right now, I'm not sure that the world is ready for that. But I would say if we don't try to do it, then we're also in trouble. So, but I think that this mechanism that is built in to the Paris Agreement, where also next year we will have a follow-up COP, where the countries have to report how far they are. I don't know if you know that, but I think that will be a sign of how serious the individual countries are. What we see on the electricity side is that the new investments that are taking place globally is in renewables, and so that's a good sign. But then we have some bad signs, which is that let's say the level of transition for other sectors, or that the pace of transition for other sectors is not going to the same speed, or in the same speed as we see on the electricity side. Like electric cars, for example, electric trucks, aviation, agriculture, industry. There's a lot of other sectors apart from the electricity sector that are only really in the childhood of this transition. So I do believe we can do a lot on the electricity side. I'm rather worried on all of the other elements of this transition.
Thank you. Any more questions? Doesn't seem to be the case. Well then, Brian, with that, many thanks for your presentation.
You're welcome.
And answers. And I'm pretty sure that for those of you, either online or here, who wants to follow up with Brian on questions or advice, he's always available. Not always, but yeah, it's approachable.
Approachable, yeah.
So with these words, this afternoon, once again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.